أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم. Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. In the name of Allah, the most compassionate, the most merciful. Verily, our praise is due to Allah. We praise Him, we seek His aid, and we ask for His forgiveness. We seek refuge in Allah from the evils of our own selves and from the evils of our own actions. And whomsoever Allah guides, none can misguide. And whomsoever Allah leaves astray, none can guide back to the correct path. Ashhadu an la ilaha illallah. Ashhadu anna Muhammadan abduhu wa rasuluhu sallallahu alayhi wa sallam. We testify there is no deity worthy of our worship except for Allah, who is alone in a partnership and never has and never will be another. And we bear witness that Muhammad, peace and blessings be upon him, is the last and the final prophet of Allah. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuhu, brothers and sisters, friends and family, everybody tuning into the live stream, and everybody joining us for the Zoom meeting, which we encourage you to join in for the discussions. Thank you for joining again for our Sunday discussion, the book reading and reflections on Al-Muhaddithat, the Women Scholars in Islam by Mohammad Akram Nadwi. So we had left off from last week. We just finished chapter number 8 in regards for the women in Hadith critique, where their emphasis came on that the historical background regarding that, checking one another, and the chain of transmission that came from them. Now we're getting over to an overall view regarding period and region, starting with the first period here. We have a little some maps and whatnot to keep us oriented. So for those who are watching the presentation here, inshallah, it's going to be a little bit different than usual, but mashallah, it'll be good as a visual support for this week's and this chapter's reading, at least going forward, at least until we get to towards the end here. So, alhamdulillah, without further ado, let's go ahead and jump right in. Chapter number 9, the overview by period and region. Bismillah. So at no time in Islamic history, including the present, and in no part of the Islamic world, past or present, has study of hadith been considered among Muslims themselves as either redundant or obsolete. On the contrary, the relevance and the utility of hadith for teaching the believers how to embody the guidance of Islam in their transactions with God and with each other have always been securely fixed at the deepest level of their commitment as believers. That said, active engagement in the study and teaching of Hadith has varied in scope and volume in different times and places. In particular, the number of women engaged in the receiving and diffusing of Hadith, though not localized to a particular region or period, has varied markedly, at least if judged by the material that has been compiled on this book, Al-Muhaddithat. Interestingly, the change by period and region in the numbers of men engaged in Hadith study does mostly, but does not always correspond to the change in the number of women. And variation in the quality or level of attention that a particular body of knowledge receives is normal. To some degree, it can be observed in all branches of knowledge, in all arts and crafts and patterns of industry and commerce, and in every civilization. And it is a function of how, in a particular setting, interest in a body of knowledge is motivated, how costs and rewards for engaging with it are perceived, where it fits within broader conceptions of the purposes that education is supposed to serve in the community providing it. I try in this chapter to give a sense of the general outline of when and where Hadith study and teaching among the women intensified, declined, and revived. And the outline is what the material in gross qualitative terms suggests to me, at least a very early stage of studying the material. I offer only very tentative explanations for the bigger shifts recorded. It will not be possible to offer some more secure explanations until the biographical accounts and mentions of women scholars and students can be analyzed systematically and then set alongside relevant information about the socioeconomic and legal and political conditions in which the work with Hadith was done. So the divisions by region are self-explanatory. As for the time periods, the material seems to me to fall into four main phases. The first and second century after the Hijrah, so we're talking 600 to 700 leading into 800 CE and corresponding with the further dates. And in this period, first, women narrators of Hadith are both many and conspicuous, and the Hadiths of women companions and successors are widely circulated and recorded in the precursors of the six books and other major collections. On the 2nd to 5th century after the Hijrah, it is a relatively weak period for women narrators, but a peak period for men scholars and students of Hadith, and the six books and major specialist studies are written at this time. And the 3rd century is the weakest for women scholars, their numbers recovering gradually through the 4th and the 5th century. 6th to the 9th, after the Hijrah century, after the time of the women companions, this is the brightest period of the history of the Muhaddithat. And from the 6th century, their numbers grow rapidly, peaking in the 8th, beginning to go down in the 9th. And lastly, now leading into the modern Muslim era, the 10th to the 15th uh, century, the period is clear scholarly decline among Muslims in all Islamic sciences, including hadith, and decline is not particular to women. It also includes men as well. So as we're starting off in that first period here, this is considered to be the best, the normative period of Islam, and it is the period of the companions, where the men and women who learned the religion from the Prophet ﷺ himself, of the successors, many of whom accompanied the companions in long years of apprenticeship, and of those who followed the successors, and who, by the end of this period, had formalized the practice of their teachers into a strict and solid scholarly discipline. And the hadith of the women of this period are recorded in the major compilations of hadith. And as you can see in the map here, inshallah, as we're starting with the first major Islamic empire past the time of the Rashidun Caliphate, the Umayyad Caliphate, which under the time 130 after the Hijrah was really the extent from all the way in Spain, Cordoba, Spain, all the way into what would be modern day Kabul, into Afghanistan, and leading into the edges of modern day India. So we're going to back this view up here. So we'll keep it to the side here so we can keep it for perspective and a reminder regarding the first period here. So most important and the most famous figure of the hadith in the fiqh is Aisha. So she has narrated 2,210 hadiths. 297 of those hadith are in the Sahihs of Al-Bukhari and Muslim, so we're talking more than 10%. 174 are found in both, with 54 in Al-Bukhari and 69 in Muslim, not recorded in the other. And in sheer abundance of hadith in the six books, she is second only to Abu Huraira, anhu. And the total of her hadiths in the six books is 2,081, whereas Abu Huraira's is 3,370. And in knowledge of the religion, Aisha was a point of reference for the companions. Abu Musa al-Ash'ari had said that whenever any matter became difficult for us, the companions of the Prophet ﷺ, then we asked Aisha about it. We found that she had gotten knowledge of that. So probably one of the most pivotal, I mean, of course, next to Abu Huraira, but pivotal moment or a pivotal person in regards to understanding the religion, and especially with such a close relation to the Prophet ﷺ, with being his wife, and with her length of her life, as well as her interaction with the Muslim world, became very important regarding this. So next to Aisha in abundance of hadith is Salama, again, another wife of the Prophet ﷺ. Altogether, she had 378 hadiths, of which Al-Bukhari and Muslim both record 13, while Al-Bukhari had another 3 and Muslim 13. And among other women companions who narrated a lot of hadith is Asma bint Yazid ibn al-Sakan, who narrated 81, Al-Mu'minin Maymuna, who narrated 76, al-Mu'minun Hafsa, who narrated 60, and Asma bint Umayyas, who also narrated 60 hadith. So even when we're looking at top 5, we're looking at, regards for women hadiths, we're looking at the wives of the Prophet ﷺ. So among 3 out of the 5 being the wives of the Prophet ﷺ. Among the most famous women narrators in this generation of the successors is Amra bint Abd al-Rahman, and in the six books and other major collections, her hadiths are plentiful. And she grew up in the house of Aisha and learned a lot of hadiths from her and others. And Omar ibn Abd al-Aziz said, "No one is living who, excuse me, no one is now living who has more knowledge of Aisha's hadith than Amra, and he benefited much by her counsel." And Al-Zuhri said, Qasim ibn Muhammad said to me, "I see, my boy, that you are greedy for knowledge. Should I not inform you of the vessel of knowledge? Go and stick with Amra, and for she was under the guardianship of Aisha." And Al-Zuhri said, "Then I came to her, and I found her an ocean. Its water never goes." And another expert of this period is the great Muhadditha of Basra, Hafsa bint Sirin, the sister of the renowned scholar Mohammad ibn Sirin, and her hadiths too are found in all major compilations. Iyas ibn Muawiyah relied on her in preference even to Hassan al-Basri and Mohammed ibn Sirin, and al-Safadi says she was unique in her time as a jurist, truthful, virtuous, and of great rank. And another expert of this period is the famous scholar of Syria, al-Darda, whose hadiths are also abundant in the sources. And al-Dhahabi praises her for her juristic knowledge and intelligence and for her devotion to worship. And Ibn Kathir said she was a tabiyah, devout scholar and jurist, and men studied with her and learned fiqh from her in her teaching places on the north side of the Umayyad Mosque. And Abd al-Malik ibn Marwan, when he was caliph, used to sit in her circle with other students. SubhanAllah. And among many examples of well-known women scholars of the second century, Ajad the Tabiyat were al-Aswad al-Huzariya and Ubayd bint Nabil al-Hijaziyah. And al-Aswad narrated hadith from Munya bint Ubayd al-Islamiyah and Na'ila al-Huzayiyah, and Ahmed ibn Abdullah ibn Yunus, Abd al-Rahman ibn Amr al-Bajali, Muslim ibn Ibrahim al-Azdi, and Yunus ibn Muhammad al-Muad'Dib narrated from her, and al-Ijli said she was a reliable Kufan narrator. And Ubayd bint Nabil narrated from Aisha bint Sa'ad ibn Abi Waqqas, and among her students were Ishaq ibn Muhammad al-Ba'arwi, al-Hasib ibn Nasi, Muhammad ibn Umar al-Waqidi, and Ma'an ibn Isa al-Kazaz. And it was clearly noticeable in terms of narrating hadith, the time of the women companions is the most shining period, and this continued much the same into the time of their successors. However, in the generation of those after the successors, there are far fewer women whose hadiths are recorded in the famous compilations. And the most likely reason for this is that the men's interest in hadith was becoming very strong, and they were traveling extensively to collect hadiths from every city and in a short as time as possible. And when traveling then was arduous. So when they were compiling the hadiths, they recorded from the women of their generation only the hadiths that they could not get from men scholars whom it was easier to find and find out about. And this trend became still more pronounced in the next period, which is then the second period here, moving into the third into the 5th century. So now we are talking about Seljuk Sultanate and division Moavids inside, leading into the western end of the Islamic Empire. I'm not too familiar with the separations of power for this one here, inshallah. But going into the second period here, the 3rd and the 5th century after the Hijrah, this is the so-called golden period of hadith study, and when the major genres of hadith compilations and the major compilations are put together and then circulated. It is also the period when traveling for the knowledge is at its peak, and in the beginning of the second century, there are scholars of the rank of Al-Zuhri in Medina, Amr ibn Dinar in Mecca, Qatada and Yahya ibn Abi Kathir in Basra, Abu Ishaq al-Sabi'i and al-Amash in Kufa. And at the end of the century, Malik in Medina, Ibn Unayna in Mecca, Shubba in Basra, Sufyan al-Thawri in Kufa, and by the beginning of the third century, all of the major centers of Hadith in Kufa, Basra, Baghdad, and Haramain, Syria, and Egypt are dominated by male scholars. And women appear to be so far absent from the circles of Hadith teachers that we do not find a single woman named among the long list of the teachers of Al-Bukhari, Muslim, Al-Tirmidhi, Abu Dawud, Nasa'i, and Ibn Majah, the authors of the six books. So before this period, by contrast, we find women named among the teachers of Abu Hanifa, Malik, Sufyan, Al-Thawri, and Shu'bah. So what might explain this abrupt absence of women's teachers? So we need to differentiate between receiving, quote unquote, the knowledge and transmitting it. As for the former, women continued to study Hadith, and there was no indication that people paid less attention to the education of their daughters. And it will be remembered that Malik's daughter Fatima memorized the whole of his Muwatta and became a narrator of Hadith, while his son did not. And the crucial difference appears to be the increased importance at the time of traveling between different teachers in different towns and collecting the hadith of every major center of learning in the Islamic world. So women cannot have had the same faculty or facility to undertake long and arduous journeys in the path of knowledge or to absent themselves from the duties of the family. And with some exceptions, their hadiths were mostly acquired from their family and the scholars in their near locality. Also, the traveling students are coming from outer regions into the heartlands of Islam. Each of the authors of the six books is an example. In their places of origin, Hadith scholars, especially among women, is not yet established. So we cannot imagine them narrating from the women of their family or of their hometowns. And then on arriving to the heartlands of Islam, they have a very limited time to which to acquire as many hadiths as possible before moving on. So naturally, they will be inclined to sit with those teachers who have had themselves travel extensively and collected large numbers of hadiths. And also being strangers, they can have had only limited, if any, knowledge of the women scholars active in the town they are passing through, and only limited, if any, access to them. So finally, it would be very rare by the third century that a woman has knowledge of the hadiths that have not been already circulated and can be heard reliably narrated by men to whom the visiting students do have access. So that being said, those scholars who had access to the Muhaddithat in the heartlands of Islam did narrate from them, so their names and also their hadiths have survived. So, for an example, in Medina, Imam Sham al-Din al-Jazari narrates with his isnad to Bakr ibn Ahmad al-Qasri, who narrated from Fatima bint Ali ibn Musa al-Rida, from Fatima, Zainab, and Kulthum, all three daughters of Musa ibn Jafar, who narrated from Fatima bint Jafar ibn Muhammad al-Sadiq, that she said, Fatima bint Muhammad ibn Ali narrated to me, saying Fatima bint Ali ibn al-Hussein narrated to me, saying that Fatima and Sakina, daughters of Hussein ibn Ali, narrated to me from Kulthum bint Fatima bint al-Nabi sallallahu alaihi wasallam, saying, have you forgotten the Prophet's word to Ali? You are to me as Harun was to Musa. Also in Medina, Aisha bint al-Zubair ibn Hisham ibn Urwa, whose hadiths have been recorded by Qadi Abu Abdullah al-Mahamili. In Baghdad in this period, Rahina's wife of Ahmad ibn Hanbal and his slave Husin both received hadiths from him. And in Kufa, there was Fatima bint al-Zayd, and al-Khatib al-Baghdadi has narrated her hadith. And in Kufa, there was Fatima bint Muhammad ibn Abd al-Rahman ibn Sariq, whose hadith were recorded by Hafs Umar ibn Shaheen. And in Basra, the hadith of Ghufariya bint Waqid were recorded by Ibn Hibban. In Wasit, there was Fatima bint Ishaq ibn Wahab ibn al-Alaf al-Wasiti, and her hadiths were recorded by Imam al-Tabarani. And in Syria, there was al-Abbas Lubayba bint Yahya ibn Ahmad ibn Ali ibn Yusuf al-Khoraz, whose hadiths were recorded by al-Khattab al-Baghdadi. And near the end of the 3rd century, hadith activity started to decline, a trend that continued until the 5th. And perhaps the 4th century is the weakest for hadith activity amongst the women. And in this century, Baghdad is the major center of Muhaddithat. And one of the famous ones among them is Amat al-Wahid bint al-Hussein ibn Ismail al-Mahamili and uh, Daraqutni says she learned hadith from her father, Ismail ibn al-Abbas al-Waraq, Abd al-Ghafir ibn Salama al-Himsi, Abd al-Hasan al-Misri, Hamza al-Hashimi, and others. And she memorized the Quran and learned fiqh according to Imam al-Shafi'i's school and other sciences. And another example is Fatima bin Abd al-Rahman al-Haraniya, who was born in Baghdad, then brought to Egypt, where people studied hadith with her. And another example is Amat al-Salam bint al-Qadi Abu Bakr, and the names of a number of her students are found in Al-Khattab. So an important feature of this century is that we begin to find Muhaddithat in Khorasan and Trexonia, and their numbers continued to grow in this part of the world until it was destroyed then, of course, by the Mongols at the beginning of the 7th century. And among the famous traditions of the area in the 4th century were Salama Amina bint Abd Sa'id al-Hasan ibn Ishaq ibn Bulbul al-Naysaburi, Juma'ah bint Ahmad ibn Mohammad ibn Abdullah al-Mahamiya from Nishapur, who also taught hadith in Baghdad, and Abdullah Zainab bint Abd al-Rahman ibn Muhammad al-Ijiliya, who taught hadith in Jordan in 347. So toward the end of the 4th century, we find the first records of people bringing young children, even infants, to the hadith classes. And those who heard hadith before they were 5 were expected to report their hearing by using the formula, "we attended the hearing" rather than "we heard." And however, some scholars did not approve even this. And al-Dahabi says in his account of Abu al-Qasim Abdullah ibn al-Hafiz ibn Muhammad al-Hasan ibn Muhammad al-Khalal, brought by his father to hear hadith from Abu Hafs al-Qatani. His hearing from al-Qatani was when he was in his 5th year, and from this time the system went upside down. Rather, ijaza is better in strength than this attendance, for whoever heard hadith just attending a class without understanding, he did not receive anything. The one who has got ijaza has got something. Yes, if along with the attendance there is a permission from the sheikh, that is better. So in the 5th century, women of the non-Arab countries expelled the Arabs in the field of teaching and narrating hadiths. For example, Nashapur Fatima bint Abi Ali al-Hasan Ibn al-Ali al-Daqaq taught major books of hadith, including the Musnad of Abu Awama, and al-Sam'ani says she was the pride of the women of her time. No one similar to her has been seen in her good character. She was a scholar of the Book of God and virtuous. And if Hassan, there was Aisha bint Hassan ibn Ibrahim al-Warakaniya al-Asbahaniya, and she taught hadith regularly. Ibn Sama'ani says, I asked Hafiz Ismail about her, and he said, she is a righteous woman scholar. She gives sermons to the women, and she wrote down Amali of Ibn Manda from him, and she is the first person from whom I got hadith. My father sent me to study with her, and she was an aesthetic. And in Hurat, there was Biba bint Abd al-Samad al-Haratha Mia, and al-Sama'ani says she was a righteous and pure woman, and the people who learned hadith from her cannot be counted. And in Amr, there was Karima bint Ahmad ibn Muhammad ibn Hatim al Marwaziyah, who taught Sahih Bukhari many times. About her, Al-Samani wondered if anyone had seen her like among the women. And yes, I do have the third period here. So third period here, as we open up here. Now we're talking about the time period after the Mongol Empire, and we're going into the uh, starting periods of the Ottoman Empire. Um, After the conquering of Constantinople, into the ninth century after the Hijra. So in this period of the third period, the Islamic world suffered two catastrophes, the like of which it had never experienced before and has not experienced since then until our own time, which was first being the destruction of Jerusalem and parts of Palestine by the Crusaders, and the Mongols' destruction of major parts of the Eastern Muslim world, including Baghdad and the Abbasid Caliphate. Yet, in despite of the destruction suffered during it, this period is characterized by a revival of Hadith sciences after a long period when fiqh had been more dominant. And this revival is also reflected in the women's role in study and teaching of Hadith. And indeed, except for the time of the women companions, this period is the best for the women's advancement in and major contribution to the Hadith. And the comment by Al-Dahabi quoted earlier refers to this time in his biographical account of Imam Hafiz Abu Abdullah, Muhammad ibn Mahmud ibn al-Najjar. He writes, Ibn al-Sa'ati says among his teachers were 3,000 men and 400 women. So, how could so great a disaster as the loss of Jerusalem and major defeats in Central Asia and Mesopotamia coincide with the rise of interest in Hadith? And the answer is that great catastrophe can shake people up individually and collectively, enable them to rethink their commitments to either save or forever lose their way of life. And the terrible events the Muslims had to endure led them to return to their tradition and strive to rescue their religion and reform their society. So for Muslims, the only reform that is sound Islamically is the one that strives to guide people by the Sunnah of God's Messenger, Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam. And this explanation is supported by the fact that the revival began with the scholars of Jerusalem and the people of Syria. They were the ones most directly affected by the political and the military disasters of the Crusades. And Ibn Sakir Dimashqi and the family of Ibn Qudama, who left Jerusalem as the Crusaders occupied it, settled in Damascus. And here they revived the Hadith sciences. Then others of the same mind later joined them from elsewhere in Syria. And their women also participated in their great efforts to consolidate and revive, quote unquote, the knowledge. So when the renewed quest for the knowledge had first begun, the major centers of Hadith were not in Damascus or Cairo. Rather, the people in quest of the knowledge had to travel to Baghdad or further east to Isfahan. And in Baghdad, there were a large number of female traditionalists to whom the people traveled. And the most important among them was Shuhada bint al-Ibri and Tajani bint Abdullah ibn Wahabaniya, and all the major traditionalists of the time studied with them. And in Safan, the most important Shaykha at this time was Fatima bint Abdullah ibn, uh, 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 I'm sorry, Abdullah al-Juzdaniya, who was considered one of the most outstanding figures in the whole history of Hadith. And as her student, Fatima bin Sa'ad al-Khayr, who deferred Hadith in Damascus and then in Cairo. And by the end of the century, Hadith sciences had strengthened greatly in Damascus so that it was becoming established as a major center. And among the women teachers of Hadith in this period was Amina bint Muhammad ibn al-Hassan ibn Tahir ibn Awrar al-Dimashqiyya. She studied Hadith with her grandfather, the Qadi Abu al-Mufaddal Yahya ibn Ali al-Qurayshi and Abu Muhammad Abu al-Karim ibn Hamza, and her father obtained for her a copy of the Sunan of Abu Dawud, and she read part of it with Abu al-Karim ibn Hamza and Qadi uh, Muhyi al-Din Abu Ma'ali ibn Zaki, Shihab al-Din al-Qusi, and others studied with her. And she was also endowed a ribat in Damascus. And that Ibn al-Najjar studied hadith with 400 women teachers during this period is not the only record we have of their activity. Hafiz ibn Asakir received hadith from more than 80 women, and his colleagues and a famous traditionalist, Abu Sa'ad al-Sam'ani, has provided the account of 69 of his shaykhs, and Abu Tahir al-Salafi studied with a score of women teachers, and even Ibn al-Jawzi, a famous scholar and great preacher who never traveled, has narrated from three women. And the 7th century began with the cataclysm of the Mongol devastation. Uh, Chinggis Khan began his campaign against the Horazm Mesa in 616, and his hordes destroyed Bukhara, Samarkand, Hamadan, uh, Zinjan, Qazwin, Marw, and Nishapur. And under his grandson Halagu, they entered Baghdad and laid waste to the city, all of its treasures, including the library. They massacred its people, and then they headed to Aleppo and did the same. And they occupied Damascus in Jumada al-Ula 658, and on their march to Egypt, they suffered their first major defeat in Ain Jalut in Ramadan 658. Then the Mamluk Sultan Baybars turned the tide of war decisively in the Muslims' favor and forced the Mongols to flee Syria, although they remained on its borders and the danger of incursions and looting raids persisted. And the consequences of the Mongol invasions were severe, and the centers of scholarships in Samarkand, Bukhara, Nishapur, and Baghdad were utterly devastated, and they never regained their importance as centers of hadith study and teaching. And it is a mercy that just before that disaster, Syria and Egypt had become established as major focal points for Islamic scholarship. And the Mamluk rule over Egypt and Syria endured from 649 to 923. And during this period, scholarly life became more dynamic, and many grand colleges and mosques were built in the Mamluk domains. And the revival of Hadith had begun in Syria before it took hold in Egypt, when, as noted earlier, the family, friends, and followers of Sheikh Ahmed ibn Muhammad ibn Qudama left Palestine in 551 and settled in Qasyun in Damascus. And here Sheikh Abu Ammar Muhammad ibn Qudama al-Maqdisi built al-Madrasa al-Umariyah in 555. And some years later, in 599, Jami al-Hanabila was built there. So both were very important centers for Hadith sciences, and the first center dedicated expressly for the study of Hadith was Dar al-Hadith al-Nuriya in Damascus in 559, founded by the Sultan Nur al-Din al-Shahid al-Malik Kamil al-Ayyub. Had built Dar al-Hadith al-Kamaliya in 622 in Cairo, and his brother al-Malik Ashraf built two more centers for Hadith study in Damascus. And these institutions proved to be vital resources for the community in Syria and Egypt in the 7th century, and subsequently, they also included women teachers and women students, most of whom names had preserved in the records of Sama'at attached to the Hadith books. And in the biographical dictionary in Al-Muhaddithat, 5 volumes are devoted to the women of the 7th century and 6 volumes each of their 8th and 9th centuries. So, as well as Syria and Egypt, Hadith scholarship among women also grew in the cities of Haramain. Perhaps 90% of the entries in the dictionary for the 7th to 9th century are for the women of Syria, Egypt, and Haramain. And for that, we'll stop now at the introduction going into the 4th period, 900 to 1500 years after the Hijrah, and we'll continue in the following week then. Thank you for joining, and we hope to see you then. Allahumma subhanahu wa bihamdi, ashhadu an la ilaha illa anta astaghfiruka wa atubu ilaik. Assalamu alaikum.